I'm Anya Sharma, and welcome to the Unredacted Files, where the facts are fuzzy and the fiction is forensic. It's up to you to decide if what you are hearing is fact or fiction. So join me as we weave this tangled web of deception, mystery, murder, betrayal, and intrigue. But beware, everything isn't always as it seems, and you probably should have known that. Tonight, we venture north to the last frontier, Alaska, a land of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving wilderness, but also a place where shadows can stretch long and deep, concealing secrets within its burgeoning cities. Our focus falls on Anchorage, specifically the historic and often notorious Spenard district. For a period in the late 1970s and early 1980s, as oil money flowed and the city pulsed with a transient energy, a different kind of darkness took root in Spenard. A series of disappearances, followed by horrifying discoveries, hinted at a predator of terrifying intelligence and brutality, a spectre haunting the neon-lit streets and dimly lit alleyways. This is the story of a community gripped by fear, an investigation fraught with challenges, and a figure who seemed to embody the chilling duality of man. Chapter 1. The Vanishing of Sarah. A Dream Deferred. Spenard, Anchorage. Even its name carries a certain frontier grit. Historically a separate entity before being absorbed by the growing city, Spenard began as a lumber camp, evolving into a district known for its independent streak and, by the 1970s, a reputation for being the city's entertainment hub, which included a well-known red light district. With the Trans-Alaska pipeline boom, it became a magnet for workers flush with cash, and with them came an explosion of bars, nightclubs, and establishments catering to a wide array of appetites, some less savoury than others. Spenard Road, the main artery of the district, pulsed with a raw, often chaotic energy, a place where fortunes could be made and lost overnight, and where anonymity was a readily available commodity. It was a place of stark contrasts, new money and old grit, dazzling opportunity, and deep-seated desperation, the bright lights often failing to penetrate the shadowy corners. It was into this vibrant, volatile milieu that Sarah Marie Jensen arrived in the spring of 1978. At 22, she was a whirlwind of restless energy and prairie optimism, having driven up from her native Minnesota with 2 college friends, chasing adventure and the promise of high wages. Her eyes were firmly set on earning enough money waitressing to fund her ultimate dream, a sun-drenched apartment in Southern California, far from the biting Minnesota winters, and, as it would turn out, the even more formidable Alaskan ones. She found a job at the Northern Star Diner, a bustling 24-hour eatery just off Spenard Road, a stone's throw from the infamous Spenard Strip. The diner was popular with truckers, pipeline workers, and the late-night revelers spilling out of nearby bars. Sarah, with her quick wit, infectious laugh, and an uncanny ability to remember regulars' orders and their stories, became a small beacon of warmth in the often impersonal churn of the boomtown. She shared a small, slightly cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a newer complex bordering Spenard and the more residential area of Turnagain, with 2 other young women, also recent arrivals to Anchorage, both working in the burgeoning service industry. On the evening of Thursday, October 12, 1978, Sarah worked the late shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. It was a typically busy night, the diner filled with the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversations. Her last customers were a group of 4 construction workers, loud and boisterous, who had been regaling her with tales of their work on a remote pipeline station. They left her a generous tip. Around 12:15 a.m., she cashed out her earnings for the night, said goodnight to the head cook, Miguel Ramirez, a burly, kind-hearted man who often looked out for the younger waitresses, and the dishwasher, a quiet, older man named Arthur Jenkins who rarely spoke. Miguel would later tell police he remembered Sarah seeming a little tired, her usual effervescence slightly dimmed, but otherwise in good spirits. She'd been talking about a letter she'd received from her younger sister back in Minnesota, excited about her sister's upcoming high school graduation. Arthur Jenkins, a man of few words, recalled her zipping up her light blue quilted windbreaker, a distinctive item her mother had sent her, and waving a cheerful "see ya" as she stepped out into the crisp, clear autumn air. The temperature was dropping rapidly, hovering just above freezing, and the scent of wood smoke from nearby residential chimneys hung faintly, a quintessential Alaskan aroma. Sarah's usual route home was a walk of about 15 blocks, a little over a mile. She typically cut through a series of quieter residential side streets to avoid the sometimes rowdy main drag of Spenard Road late at night, a route she felt was safer. Her roommates, Cindy and Pam, expected her around 12:45 a.m. When she hadn't arrived by 1:30 a.m., they began to worry, exchanging anxious glances. Sarah was usually punctual, always calling if she was going to be significantly late. By 2 a.m., a knot of real, sickening fear had formed in their stomachs. They called the diner. Miguel answered, his voice heavy with sleep, and confirmed Sarah had left on time just after midnight. They called a few of Sarah's other friends in Anchorage no one had seen or heard from her. At 3 a.m., their anxiety reaching a fever pitch, Cindy and Pam called the Anchorage Police Department. The initial police response, as her roommates would later recount with a lingering bitterness and frustration, was somewhat dismissive, almost perfunctory. A young woman, working late in Spenard, disappears. "She's probably just blown off some steam, honey, gone home with someone," the desk sergeant on duty reportedly told Cindy over the phone. "They turn up, give it a day or two." It was a common refrain in a city with a high transient population, a place where people often came and went with little notice. An officer took a missing person report over the phone, noting Sarah's description: 5'5", blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing the blue windbreaker and jeans, but conveyed little sense of urgency. For the first crucial 48 hours, Sarah Jensen was officially categorized by the APD as a probable voluntary disappearance, a statistic, another young person swallowed by the city's churn. Her family, contacted by her frantic roommates in a small farming town in Minnesota, pleaded with the APD via long-distance calls to take her disappearance more seriously. Her mother, Eleanor Jensen, a stoic woman of immense inner strength, insisted Sarah was responsible, level-headed, and not the type to vanish without a word, especially not without her carefully saved California money. She described Sarah's meticulous plans, the postcards of sunny beaches pinned to her bulletin board, the savings account she was diligently building. It wasn't until Eleanor Jensen, accompanied by Sarah's older brother Tom, flew into Anchorage 3 days later, their faces etched with anguish and a grim determination, that the investigation gained any real traction. Eleanor, a force of nature fueled by maternal fear, launched a relentless campaign. She and Tom, with the help of Sarah's roommates and a few sympathetic locals, plastered missing posters featuring Sarah's bright, hopeful high school graduation photo on every lamppost, in every store window, in every bar in Spenard and downtown Anchorage. Eleanor hounded the police department daily, demanding updates, refusing to be placated by bureaucratic assurances. She spoke to local news outlets, her tearful pleas broadcast on the evening news, putting a human face to the growing unease in the city. Under this pressure, detectives were assigned to the case full-time. They re-interviewed Miguel Ramirez, the cook. He confirmed Sarah had seemed normal, if a little tired. He now recalled, with more clarity, a dark-coloured sedan, possibly an older model Ford LTD or a Chevy Impala, that he'd seen idling across the street from the diner, its engine running around closing time for a few nights that week. He hadn't paid it much attention at the time, assuming it was someone waiting for another employee or a late-night customer. He couldn't recall any details about the driver only that the car was dark and seemed out of place. Arthur Jenkins, the dishwasher, when questioned again, remembered nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that stood out. He was a man who kept his head down. Detectives canvassed the route Sarah usually took home, knocking on doors, but no one reported seeing a young woman matching her description walking alone that late. No one recalled hearing any screams or sounds of a struggle. The distinctive blue windbreaker became a focal point of the meagre descriptions, a splash of colour against the drabness of a case rapidly growing cold. The trail, if there ever was one, was being obliterated by every passing hour, every fresh layer of autumn frost that settled on the city. Sarah Jensen had vanished as if into the thin, cold Alaskan air. Chapter 2. The Spenard social scene and Lisa's last night. While Sarah Jensen's family and a small circle of friends grappled with her inexplicable and terrifying disappearance, life in Spenard for most of its denizens continued its frenetic oil-fueled pace. The bars along the Spenard Strip pulsed with live music, country, rock, the occasional jazz combo. The liquor flowed freely, and the promise of fleeting connections, of easy money, or simply of forgetting the harsh realities of pipeline work for a few hours, drew crowds nightly. It was a world unto itself, a subculture within Anchorage with its own rules, its own dangers, its own particular brand of frontier hedonism. One of the most iconic and arguably infamous establishments in the district was, and indeed still is, Chilkoot Charlie's, affectionately and ubiquitously known as Coots. Founded in 1970, Coots was more than just a bar. It was a sprawling, multi-level labyrinth of interconnected drinking spaces, dance floors, and uniquely themed rooms, from a rustic Alaskan cabin to a sawdust-strewn beer hall. It was a Spenard institution, a rite of passage for many newcomers, a place where everyone from roughneck pipeline workers and off-duty military personnel to university students and local business people congregated, often in a boisterous, alcohol-fueled haze. Lisa Marie Petrova, 19 years old, was one of those university students. A bright, ambitious, and somewhat introverted sophomore at the University of Alaska Anchorage, UAA, majoring in biology with aspirations of going to medical school, Lisa was, in many ways, a stark contrast to the rougher edges of Spenard's typical clientele. She was studious, a member of the university debate club, and lived in a shared rental house in the university UMed district, a quieter, more academic enclave that felt a world away from Spenard's nightlife in terms of atmosphere, though geographically it was only a few miles distant. However, like many young people in Anchorage, even the more serious-minded ones, she wasn't entirely immune to the allure of a night out, a chance to unwind with friends. On Friday, November the 17th, 1978, just over a month after Sarah Jensen had vanished from the streets of Spenard, Lisa and two of her closest friends from UAA, Karen Miller and Jenna Hughes, decided to venture into Coots. It was Karen's 20th birthday, and she had insisted on celebrating at the legendary Spenard hotspot. Lisa, usually more inclined towards a quiet evening with a book or a campus movie, had been hesitant, but was eventually persuaded. She even borrowed a new, fashionable red knit scarf from Jenna for the occasion. They arrived at Coots around 9:30 p.m. The place was already thrumming with energy, the parking lot overflowing. They found a slightly sticky table in one of the less raucous sections, near a stage where a local rock band was tuning up, and ordered a round of beers. According to Karen and Jenna's later statements to police, Lisa had a couple of light beers over the next few hours, but was by no means intoxicated. She was a cautious drinker, always mindful of her early classes. She danced a little when the band started playing, chatted animatedly with her friends, and seemed to be genuinely enjoying herself, laughing at Karen's stories. Around 1 a.m., as the crowd at Coots reached its peak, Lisa mentioned she was feeling tired and wanted to head home. She had an early Saturday morning study group for her organic chemistry class. Her friends, buoyed by the party atmosphere and planning to stay later, urged her to take a cab, offering to chip in for the fare. But Lisa, ever independent and perhaps feeling a little overcautious after the recent news about Sarah Jensen's disappearance, insisted she was fine to drive. She'd parked her aging but reliable mustard yellow Datsun beat at 210 in a dimly lit side street lot a couple of blocks from Coots, a common practice to avoid the chaotic, often jam-packed main parking area. Karen and Jenna walked her to the edge of Coots' sprawling complex, a cacophony of noise and flashing lights. Lisa adjusted her borrowed red scarf, gave them both a quick hug, and waved goodbye, a flash of crimson disappearing into the throng of people milling about on Spenard Road. That was the last time Karen Miller and Jenna Hughes saw their friend Lisa Petrova alive. The next morning, Saturday, when Lisa didn't show up for her 9 a.m. study group and wasn't answering her phone at the house, her roommates, including Karen and Jenna, began to feel a familiar prickle of unease. By late afternoon, after checking with local hospitals and still unable to reach her or anyone who had seen her after she left Coots, their unease had escalated to full-blown panic. They contacted the Anchorage Police Department. This time, perhaps sensitized by the still unresolved and increasingly publicized Sarah Jensen case and the growing media attention on missing persons in the city, the APD response was swifter and more serious. An officer was dispatched to Lisa's shared house in the UMed district. Her friends, their faces pale with worry, provided a detailed account of the previous night, emphasizing Lisa's responsible nature and her insistence on driving herself home. A patrol car, alerted to be on the lookout for Lisa's distinctive mustard yellow Datsun, located the vehicle early that evening. It was parked, somewhat haphazardly, angled awkwardly against the curb, on a quiet residential street in the Rogers Park neighborhood, an area of modest single-family homes about halfway between Coots and her own residence. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse, containing her wallet with about $20 in cash, her driver's license, and her UAA student ID, was on the passenger seat. The red knit scarf she had borrowed from Jenna was neatly folded on the dashboard. There was no sign of a struggle inside the car, no overt evidence of foul play. It was as if she had simply parked it and walked away, or been compelled to do so under duress, leaving everything behind. The discovery of Lisa's car, so eerily abandoned, its contents undisturbed yet its driver missing, sent a fresh and potent chill through the city of Anchorage. 2 young women, both last seen in the Spenard area late at night, had now vanished without a trace within the span of 5 weeks. The term Spenard Specter had not yet been officially coined by the press or police, but a palpable sense of a predatory presence, a calculating hunter stalking the city's vulnerable, was beginning to take firm hold in the public consciousness. The investigations into Sarah Jensen's and Lisa Petrova's disappearances were now running in grim parallel, the detectives desperately looking for any thread, any commonality, however tenuous, between the 2 cases. The only clear link so far: both were young women, both had connections to the Spenard district, both vanished late at night, and both were gone, swallowed by the Alaskan darkness. Chapter 3. The Hunter in the North. A shadow named Elias. As a creeping fear began to permeate the neon-lit nights and shadowed alleyways of Spenard, a figure moved through its streets, largely unnoticed, a man we will call Elias Thorne. Thorne was an imposing physical presence, standing well over 6 feet tall, perhaps 6'4" or 5", with broad, powerful shoulders and a frame that hinted at considerable, almost formidable, strength. Yet, it was not just his stature that might have drawn a second glance, but his demeanour. An unnerving quietude, a profound stillness that seemed to absorb the ambient chaos of Spenard rather than reflect it. He was highly intelligent, possessing a vocabulary and a range of knowledge that would surprise those who only saw the surface. He was articulate, even charming when he chose to be, and possessed an almost preternatural ability to blend into his surroundings, to become part of the background noise of the city, unremarkable, unmemorable. He worked a series of unassuming, often solitary jobs, perhaps carefully chosen for their access to the city's less guarded rhythms and its quiet, overlooked corners. For a period, he was a night security guard at a sprawling warehouse complex near the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, a place of echoing emptiness and deep shadows after dark, where the only sounds were the wind whistling through corrugated metal and the distant roar of jets. Later, he took a part-time position as a clerk at a dusty old used bookstore downtown, on 4th Avenue, a historic part of the city that, like Spenard, had its own share of gritty history, transient populations, and forgotten souls. These roles provided him with a cloak of legitimacy, a plausible reason to be out at odd hours, and countless opportunities to observe the ebb and flow of humanity without drawing undue attention to himself. Thorne was not a newcomer to Alaska. He had drifted north some years earlier in the mid-1970s, part of that massive wave of humanity drawn by the siren song of the pipeline, Boom Big Money, a fresh start, a land of untamed wilderness. Like many who came, he sought the promise of anonymity that the vastness of the last frontier seemed to offer, a place where one could reinvent oneself, or, perhaps more chillingly, simply unshackle a darker pre-existing nature far from the prying eyes of a more settled society. He lived in a modest, slightly run-down one-bedroom apartment on the western fringes of Spenard, near the banks of Fish Creek, an area of older, low-rise apartment buildings and less foot traffic than the main Spenard Strip. It was the kind of place few would look twice at, easily forgettable, its inhabitants often as transient as the seasons. He was a man of meticulous, almost rigid routine. He was polite to his neighbours, if somewhat aloof and uncommunicative, offering a brief nod or a quiet hello in the hallway, but never engaging in prolonged conversation, never inviting anyone into his sparsely furnished dwelling. He paid his rent on time, in cash. He kept to himself, a solitary figure. He might even have exchanged nods or brief, unremarkable pleasantries with local police officers on their beat during his nocturnal wanderings or his commutes to his night jobs. A seemingly ordinary, law-abiding citizen in a city teeming with them. He owned an older, dark-coloured American sedan, perhaps a Ford Galaxy or a Dodge Monaco unremarkable, easily lost in traffic. Its paint faded, its engine kept in just good enough repair, yet reliable enough for navigating the city streets and, more importantly, the less travelled roads leading out into the surrounding wilderness. But beneath this carefully constructed, almost obsessively maintained veneer of normalcy, Elias Thorne was a meticulous observer, a patient, calculating hunter. He studied the patterns of life in Spenard with an almost anthropological cold detachment. He noted the way young women, often working late shifts in the diners and bars to make ends meet, walked home alone, their pace quickening as they left the relative safety of the brighter streets. He memorized the routes they favored, the shortcuts they took, the times they were most vulnerable, isolated from the herd. He learned the late-night bus schedules, the quiet side streets where streetlights were few and far between, the patches of undeveloped woodland and scrub that still dotted the rapidly expanding city, places where a scream might go unheard, absorbed by the vast Alaskan silence. His intelligence was not merely academic, it was a predatory cunning, a chilling ability to understand and exploit human vulnerability, to anticipate defensive reactions, to plan with a chess master's foresight. He was, in essence, a wolf in perfectly tailored sheep's clothing, his true, monstrous nature concealed by a carefully maintained facade of the mundane, a monster hiding in plain sight, waiting for the opportune moment. Chapter 4. a pattern of brutality. The spectre takes form. The initial, desperate hope clung to by the families of Sarah Jensen and Lisa Petrova that their loved ones had simply moved on, run away from debts or bad relationships, or perhaps met with some unfortunate but isolated accident, was brutally, irrevocably shattered in the spring of 1979. The Alaskan winter is long and unforgiving, a season that locks the land and its secrets under a thick, unyielding blanket of snow and ice. But as the relentless grip of winter finally began to loosen, as the days lengthened and the frozen earth softened under the hesitant spring sun, the wilderness, as it so often does, began to give up its dead. On April 28, 1979, a date that would be seared into Anchorage's collective memory, a pair of amateur naturalists, a husband and wife team who were avid birdwatchers, were exploring the less-travelled eastern section of Russian Jack Springs Park. This large urban green space, known for its dense birch and spruce woods and its extensive network of recreational trails, was a popular spot for locals, but its more remote areas also had a reputation for attracting illicit activities and had seen its share of crime over the years. As they ventured off a main trail, drawn by the call of an unfamiliar bird, they stumbled upon a scene of unimaginable horror. Partially concealed beneath a hastily assembled, almost haphazard pile of dead branches, fallen leaves and loose soil, in a shallow, oblong depression that was clearly a makeshift grave, were human remains. The odour of decomposition, masked for months by the freezing temperatures, was now pungent in the damp spring air. The Anchorage Police Department was immediately notified. The scene was quickly cordoned off. A perimeter of yellow tape stark against the awakening green of the forest floor. Forensic investigators, their faces grim and set, began the painstaking, stomach-churning process of exhumation. The remains were badly decomposed after months under the snow and ice, scavenged by animals. The dental records, compared against those provided by Sarah Jensen's distraught family, soon provided a positive, heartbreaking identification. It was Sarah, the bright-eyed waitress from the Northern Star Diner, who had vanished without a trace on that cold October night 6 months earlier. The discovery sent a shockwave of grief, anger, and profound terror through Anchorage. This was no longer a case of missing persons. It was an unequivocally, brutally murder. The city's fragile sense of security, already frayed by the unexplained disappearances, was torn asunder. The monster was real. As the Alaskan summer of 1979 progressed, its long days of near constant daylight ironically illuminating more darkness, other grim discoveries followed. In late June, the body of another young woman, later identified through dental records as 20-year-old Maria Sanchez, a recent arrival in Anchorage working as a hotel cleaner, was found by a group of fishermen in a remote, densely wooded area along the banks of Ship Creek, a glacial waterway that flows from the Chugach Mountains through the city and into the silty waters of Cook Inlet. Maria had been reported missing from the Fairview neighborhood, another of Anchorage's older districts, with a history of transients and significant social challenges 2 months prior, in April. Her case had received less media attention than Sarah Jensen's, but her fate was no less tragic. Then, in early August, came the discovery that confirmed the city's worst fears regarding Lisa Petrova, the UAA biology student. Her skeletal remains were located by a survey crew working in a densely forested, boggy area south of Anchorage, near Potter Marsh, a well-known coastal wildlife refuge popular with birders and tourists. The location was remote, difficult to access, suggesting the killer knew the terrain well. The victims were all young women, all abducted from areas in or adjacent to Anchorage. And as forensic pathologists meticulously examined the recovered remains, despite the challenges posed by decomposition and animal predation, a terrifying and deeply disturbing signature began to emerge, a common thread of unspeakable violence. The killer, whom the press in increasingly sensational headlines was now definitively calling the Spenard Specter, was not just taking lives. He was engaging in acts of extreme ritualistic mutilation. In the cases of Sarah Jensen and Lisa Petrova, and later confirmed with Maria Sanchez, the victims' breasts had been surgically, almost clinically, removed. This specific, horrific detail, repeated across multiple victims, spoke of a deeply ingrained sadistic psychosexual compulsion, a perverse desire not just to kill but to desecrate, to possess a part of his victims in a grotesque and symbolic act of ultimate domination and objectification. The Spenard Specter was clearly no ordinary impulsive murderer. He was methodical, organised, and chillingly forensically aware, leaving frustratingly little trace evidence, no fingerprints, no fibres, no DNA that could be readily analysed with the technology of the time at the initial abduction sites or on the bodies themselves. The bodies, when found, were often in remote, carefully chosen locations, suggesting a chilling familiarity with the Alaskan terrain and a disturbing forethought in their disposal, designed to maximise the time before discovery and degrade evidence. The mutilations themselves were precise, almost surgical, performed with a sharp instrument, hinting at a disturbing level of detachment during the act, or perhaps a perverse form of expertise. The city of Anchorage, once buoyed by the optimistic, sometimes reckless, frenzy of the oil boom, now found itself in the iron grip of a terror that felt both intimately personal for the victims' families and terrifyingly incomprehensible to the wider community. The neon lights of Spenard Road, once symbols of prosperity and uninhibited excitement, now seemed to cast longer, more menacing shadows, each flicker a potential harbinger of doom, each darkened alley a place of imagined horrors. Chapter 5. The Frozen Trail. An investigation under pressure. The Anchorage Police Department, bolstered by the resources and wider jurisdiction of the Alaska State Troopers, found themselves facing an unprecedented and deeply unnerving challenge. Serial murder was not entirely unknown in Alaska's rugged and often violent history. The state's vast wilderness and isolated communities had, from time to time, been the hunting grounds for those with dark intentions and predatory instincts. But the calculated brutality, the specific ritualistic mutilations, and the apparent intelligence of the Spenard Specter were of a different, more terrifying order. This was not the work of a disorganized, opportunistic killer lashing out in a moment of passion or desperation. This was the cold, calculated predation of a thinking monster, a human shark moving silently through the city's currents. The investigation, codenamed Operation Midnight Sun by the task force, was immediately and persistently hampered by several factors unique to the Alaskan context. The sheer, overwhelming vastness of the state meant that potential dump sites for bodies were almost limitless, stretching from the dense, bear-haunted forests of the Chugach mountain range that form Anchorage's eastern backdrop, to the countless miles of remote coastline along Cook Inlet, and the sprawling, mosquito-infested muskeg and tundra that lay beyond the city limits. The transient nature of much of Anchorage's population during the pipeline era was another significant frustrating hurdle for investigators. Young women, like Sarah Jensen and Maria Sanchez, often arrived in the city seeking work and adventure, sometimes with few local connections. If they vanished, they might not be immediately reported missing, their absence only noted weeks or even months later by distant families or former roommates, by which time any forensic trail was long cold, memories faded, and potential witnesses scattered. Potential witnesses, too, could be like ghosts themselves, oil workers finishing a stint on the North Slope, drifters passing through, seasonal labourers who moved on to the next boomtown or simply vanished back into the lower 48, taking any crucial information, any fleeting glimpse of a suspicious vehicle or a strange encounter with them. And then there was the ever-present challenge of the Alaskan weather. The long, harsh winters meant that crime scenes could be buried under feet of snow for months, preserving bodies in a macabre frozen state, but also obscuring vital evidence like footprints, tire tracks, or discarded items. The spring thaw, when it finally came, could then accelerate decomposition dramatically and degrade any remaining forensic clues, turning promising leads into frustrating dead ends. Evidence collection was a constant, arduous battle against the elements, a race against time and nature. A major crimes task force was officially assembled, pulling together the most experienced homicide detectives from the Anchorage Police Department and seasoned investigators from the Alaska State Troopers. They established an incident room, its walls soon papered with maps of Anchorage and the surrounding areas, timelines of the victims' last known movements, and the hauntingly ordinary photographs of the young women whose lives had been so brutally stolen. They began the painstaking work of profiling the killer, likely intelligent, organised, probably a white male between his late 20s and early 40s, given the physical strength required. He was almost certainly familiar with the Spenard area and its social scene, perhaps even a resident or someone who worked or frequently socialised there. He almost certainly possessed a vehicle, one that was unremarkable, capable of transporting victims discreetly and navigating the rougher roads leading to remote disposal sites. The ritualistic mutilation, specifically the post-mortem removal of breasts, was a key focus for the profilers. This pointed to a deep-seated psychosexual disorder, a profound misogyny, a need for trophies or symbolic acts of possession and degradation. Was he reenacting some past trauma? Was he driven by a specific, twisted fantasy? These were the dark questions the profilers grappled with. Investigators pored over the scant details of each victim's life, desperately seeking commonalities beyond their gender and age. Who were Sarah Jensen, Lisa Petrova, Maria Sanchez? What were their routines, their social circles, their favourite haunts, their recent acquaintances? They re-interviewed witnesses again and again. Miguel Ramirez, the cook from the Northern Star Diner, who now racked his brain trying to recall more details about that idling, dark sedan. Had he seen a partial license plate, a bumper sticker, anything? Karen and Jenna, Lisa's friends from Coots, replayed their last conversation with Lisa endlessly in their minds, and for the detectives, searching for any missed clue, any flicker of unease in Lisa, any stranger who might have paid her undue attention. Bar owners, bartenders, and bouncers in Spenard were questioned repeatedly. Known sex offenders and individuals with histories of violent assault in the Anchorage area were scrutinised, their alibis checked and rechecked. The psychological toll on the investigators themselves was immense, confronted daily with the gruesome details of the Specter's savagery, the anguish of the victims' families, and the mounting public pressure. The pressure from the public and the local media was relentless, a constant drumbeat of fear and demand for action. Local newspapers like the Anchorage Daily News and the Anchorage Times ran daily updates, their headlines growing more sensational, more fearful with each new development, or, more often, with the frustrating lack of them. Spenard stalker feared. City gripped by mutilation murders. Fear was a palpable entity in the city. Women were afraid to walk alone at night, even in well-lit areas. Sales of pepper spray, personal alarms, and even firearms for self-defense skyrocketed. Self-defense classes were suddenly packed. The freewheeling, sometimes reckless, anything-goes atmosphere of Spenard was replaced by a grim, pervasive caution. Every new, unsubstantiated rumour of another disappearance, every grim discovery of unidentified remains in the wilderness, ratcheted up the public's fear and their demand for answers, for an end to the Spenard Specter's reign of terror. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, continued to live his quiet, unobtrusive life on the periphery of this storm of fear and investigation. It's a chilling, almost unbearable thought that he might have been among those casually interviewed by police during their door-to-door canvassing in his neighbourhood, a polite, unremarkable face in the crowd, offering bland, unhelpful answers, perhaps even feigning concern for the victims, his composure utterly unruffled. He would have read the newspaper accounts of his own crimes with a detached intellectual curiosity, or even a perverse sense of pride in his ability to outwit the combined forces of law enforcement. He might have observed the increased police patrols in Spenard, noted their routines, their patterns, perhaps even critiqued their investigative methods in the privacy of his own twisted mind, seeing them as adversaries in a deadly game of his own devising. This ability to exist in plain sight, to wear the mask of utter normalcy while engaging in such monstrous acts of depravity, is a hallmark of some of history's most terrifying and elusive serial predators. The investigation for a long, frustrating, and increasingly desperate period seemed to be hitting one frozen dead end after another. The Spenard Specter was too careful, too cunning, too elusive. He was a ghost in the machine of the city, a phantom leaving only terror and death in his wake. Chapter 6. A chink in the armour. The Specter's mistake. For several agonising years, from late 1978 through the early summer of 1982, Elias Thorne operated with chilling impunity, his reign of terror a dark, unspoken undercurrent to the daily life of Anchorage. The list of missing young women grew, and occasionally the vast Alaskan wilderness would yield another horrifying secret, another shallow grave, another family plunged into unimaginable grief. The task force, despite their relentless efforts, their countless hours of investigation, their dogged pursuit of every conceivable lead, seemed perpetually one step behind, always reacting to the Specter's latest atrocity rather than anticipating his next move. But even the most meticulous and intelligent predators, those who seem to operate with an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection, can make mistakes. Sometimes it's a subtle slip in their carefully established routine, a moment of uncharacteristic carelessness. Other times it's a growing boldness, a recklessness born from repeated success, a narcissistic belief in one's own invincibility, a contempt for the abilities of those who hunt them. The turning point in the long and arduous hunt for the Spenard Specter came not from a sudden forensic breakthrough with the limited technology of the era, nor from a lucky anonymous tip phoned into a police hotline. It came from an act of audacious overconfidence on Thorne's part, and, more importantly, from the extraordinary courage and fierce determination of one young woman who refused to become another silent victim. It was a relatively mild evening in the summer of 1982, specifically July 15th. The long Alaskan twilight, that ethereal period where the sun hovers just below the horizon for hours, still bathed the city in a pale, diffused glow even as late evening approached. 24-year-old Susan Parker, a registered nurse at Providence, Alaska Medical Center, had just finished watching a late movie with a colleague at the Bear Tooth Theatre pub, a popular Spenard landmark known for its independent films, its lively atmosphere, and its eclectic clientele. Her friend had caught a ride home with another group, but Susan had parked her own car, a slightly battered but reliable Toyota Corolla, a couple of blocks away, in a less well-lit auxiliary parking lot behind a row of shops. A common practice to save on parking fees or avoid the congestion of the main lots. As she approached her vehicle, keys in hand, fumbling slightly in the dim light, a tall, imposing figure suddenly emerged from the deep shadows between two parked vans. It was Elias Thorne. He moved with a swift, silent, predatory grace that belied his large frame. His intention was clear: abduction. He grabbed her from behind, one hand clamping over her mouth to stifle her screams, the other arm attempting to encircle her waist and drag her towards his own nearby dark-coloured sedan. But Susan Parker was not an easy target. Perhaps it was her nurse's training, her familiarity with crisis situations, or simply a primal, unyielding will to survive. Fueled by a surge of pure adrenaline, she fought back with a ferocity that clearly surprised and momentarily overwhelmed Thorne. She screamed, a piercing, desperate sound that, despite his hand, cut through the relative quiet of the evening. She kicked, stomped on his instep with her heel, and thrashed wildly. And, crucially, as he struggled to maintain his grip, she raked her fingernails with all her might down his face and neck, tearing at his skin, drawing blood. Thorne, momentarily stunned by her fierce, unexpected resistance, the searing pain of her scratches, and likely realising her screams would soon draw unwanted attention from the nearby theatre or passing cars, abruptly broke off the attack. He shoved her violently away, causing her to stumble and fall, then turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing as quickly and silently as he had materialised. Though deeply traumatised, bruised and shaken to her core, Susan Parker was alive. And she had seen her attacker clearly in the struggle, his face close to hers, his features illuminated briefly by a distant streetlight. She immediately scrambled to her feet, ran to a nearby all-night gas station, and contacted the police. Despite her terror, she was able to provide a remarkably detailed and composed description of her assailant. A very tall, powerfully built white male, she estimated him to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with an unnervingly calm, almost placid demeanour, even during the shocking violence of the attack. And most importantly, she emphasised the fresh, deep, bleeding scratches she had inflicted on his face and neck, specifically on his left cheek and running down towards his jawline. This was the break the beleaguered task force had been desperate for, praying for years. A living witness who had fought off the Spectre, a detailed, current physical description, and a key piece of identifying physical evidence, the fresh, prominent scratches. A police artist worked with Susan through the night, and by morning, a composite sketch was being rapidly circulated to all patrol officers, media outlets, and displayed in public places throughout Anchorage. An all-points bulletin was issued for a man matching the description, with a particular emphasis on looking for an individual with recent significant facial injuries. Just 3 days later, on the afternoon of July 18th, a seasoned APD patrol officer, Officer Dave Miller, a 10-year veteran known for his sharp eye and meticulous attention to detail, was on routine patrol in the Government Hill neighbourhood, one of Anchorage's oldest residential districts, overlooking the port. He observed a dark-coloured sedan make an illegal U-turn and pulled the vehicle over for the minor traffic infraction. As he approached the driver's side window, he noted that the driver was an exceptionally tall man, his head almost touching the car's ceiling. And then he saw them. Angry, inflamed, red welts, clearly recent scratches, running down the man's left cheek and onto his neck, partially concealed by the collar of his shirt. The driver, who identified himself with a calm, almost unnervingly polite demeanour as Elias Thorne, offered a mumbled, awkward explanation about a fight with an unruly house cat. Officer Miller, his instincts immediately on high alert, recalled the recent citywide bulletin about the attempted abduction in Spenard and the detailed description of the attacker with prominent facial scratches. The man in the car, Elias Thorne, was a near-perfect match for the composite sketch. The cat scratches looked far more like human fingernail marks. This seemingly minor traffic stop, this observant police officer noticing a detail that Elias Thorne had perhaps hoped would heal quickly, or go unnoticed under a few days' stubble was the beginning of the end for the Spenard Specter. Thorne was asked, politely but firmly, to accompany Officer Miller to the downtown police headquarters for further questioning regarding the recent assault in Spenard. The chink in his carefully constructed armour of normalcy had finally, irrevocably appeared. The net so long cast in vain across the vast and indifferent Alaskan landscape was at last beginning to tighten around the elusive and monstrous figure of Elias Thorne. Chapter 7. The Confession of a Colossus. Elias Thorne speaks. Once within the sterile, windowless confines of an interrogation room at the Anchorage Police Department headquarters, Elias Thorne underwent a chilling and profound transformation. The quiet, almost meek facade he had presented to Officer Miller during the traffic stop, the mask of the ordinary, unassuming citizen he had worn so convincingly for years, began to peel away, layer by layer. It was replaced not by a gibbering wreck consumed by guilt, nor by a snarling, cornered brute. What emerged was something far more disturbing, a chillingly articulate, highly intelligent individual who, after an initial period of calm, almost disdainful denial, seemed to develop a perverse eagerness to recount his deeds. He would speak, but it would be on his own terms, with a disturbing air of intellectual detachment, a cold self-analysis that would leave veteran detectives profoundly shaken. He didn't confess in a torrent of remorse or a cathartic breakdown of guilt. There were no tears, no pleas for understanding. Instead, Elias Thorne began to speak with a calm, measured, almost pedagogical tone, discussing his crimes with an almost academic interest in his own pathology, his own unique brand of monstrosity. This unnerving composure, this ability to dissect his own evil with such articulate precision, was reminiscent of some of history's most infamous and psychologically complex serial killers, figures like Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, who was known for his high intelligence and his articulate, if horrifying, self-analysis offered to investigators after his capture. Over several days of intense, psychologically grueling interrogation sessions, led by a team of seasoned homicide detectives and an FBI profiler who had been consulting on the case, Thorne began to lay bare the horrifying scope of his reign of terror. He started with Sarah Jensen.
Sarah was an observation. The diner, late hours, predictable. She had a light, a foolish optimism that many of them did. I watched her for perhaps a week, her route home. The blue jacket was a marker. The night she disappeared, I waited in my vehicle, down one of the side streets she favored, a place where the streetlights were conveniently broken. She walked with a brisk pace, but she wasn't truly aware. Few people are. When she passed, I simply stepped out. No struggle was necessary initially. Surprise is a powerful tool. I indicated I had a weapon, though I rarely needed to show it. Fear does the work. I directed her to my car. She was compliant, mostly. Frozen. I drove for a time out towards the Chugach foothills, a place I knew from my explorations, a place where silence is absolute. She was alive for perhaps 12 hours after I took her. In a small, disused cabin I had found some months prior, deep in the woods off the Seward Highway. It was an observation period. I wanted to understand the transition, the shift from hope to despair. We spoke, or rather, I spoke. She mostly wept. The decision to end her life was not impulsive. It was a logical conclusion of the encounter. The act itself was necessary for the culmination of the experience. The alterations were an attempt to distill the essence, to take a part that represented the whole. A permanent memento. Disposal was straightforward. Russian Jack Springs Park was chosen for its accessibility at night, yet its relative seclusion. A shallow grave. The earth was soft then, before the first hard frost.
The detectives listened, their professional composure masking the horror. Thorne then moved on to Lisa Petrova, his tone unchanged.
Lisa was different, more spirited. Coots was a chaotic hunting ground. Too many variables. But I observed her group. She left alone. Her car, the little yellow one, was parked inefficiently, away from the main lights. An easy intercept. She resisted more than Sarah. Commendable, in a futile sort of way. The process was similar. The same cabin, the same observations, the same necessary conclusion. Her disposal required more effort. Pottermarsh is a difficult place to navigate, even for one familiar with it. But its desolation offers a certain permanence for secrets.
He continued, implicating himself in other disappearances, some known to the police, others that had, perhaps, been dismissed as runaways or lost to the vastness of Alaska. He spoke of Maria Sanchez and 2 other young women whose names had never even made the missing persons lists in a significant way. For each, he recounted his methods of observation, abduction, and the chilling details of their final hours. His voice a monotone, his eyes often distant, as if replaying a particularly interesting film. When questioned about his motives, Thorne offered no simple answers, no easily categorized pathology. He spoke of a profound, lifelong sense of alienation, a feeling of being an outsider looking in on a world whose rules and emotions he found baffling, contemptible. He expressed a simmering, deep-seated rage, particularly directed towards women who, in his twisted and profoundly misogynistic perception, represented a society that had rejected, ignored, or misunderstood him. He saw them as symbols, not individuals. The mutilations, he explained with that same chilling detachment, were an attempt to possess his victims completely, to depersonalize them, to exert a final absolute control even beyond death. They were, in his mind, trophies, symbolic acts of his power and their subjugation, a way to collect and categorize his experiences. There was no single, easily digestible motive. It was a complex, horrifying tapestry woven from threads of omnipotent fantasy, power, control, sexual sadism, and a profound, echoing emptiness at the very core of his being. He seemed to view his victims not as human beings with lives, hopes, and families, but as objects for his gratification, pawns in a grotesque and solitary game he played against the world, a game he was, for a time, winning. He even offered insights into how he avoided detection for so long. His choice of unremarkable vehicle, his meticulous cleaning of any potential crime scene, his understanding of police procedure gleaned from observation and perhaps even from his time as a security guard. He spoke of the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness as his greatest ally, a place that readily accepted what he offered it. He showed an almost narcissistic pride in his ability to outwit the authorities, sometimes subtly critiquing the police investigation from his perspective, pointing out missed opportunities or flawed assumptions. The interviews with Elias Thorne were a harrowing, psychologically draining experience for the seasoned investigators. They were granted a terrifying, unprecedented journey into the abyss of a profoundly disturbed, yet highly functional and intelligent mind. He was a monster, yes, but a monster who could articulate his monstrosity with terrifying clarity, making him all the more unsettling, all the more incomprehensible. He provided them with a map, not just of where bodies were buried in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, but a chilling, unforgettable map into the darkest, most desolate territories of the human psyche. Chapter 8. The Scars on Spenard. Aftermath and Unanswered Questions. The arrest and subsequent detailed, chilling confessions of Elias Thorne brought a semblance of horrifying closure to Anchorage, and particularly to the terrorized Spenard district. The Spenard Specter, the phantom who had haunted their streets and their nightmares for nearly 4 agonizing years, finally had a face and a name. But it was a closure, deeply, irrevocably scarred by the horrors he had inflicted, a profound wound on the city's collective soul that would take generations to fade, if it ever truly could. Families of the victims. Sarah Jensen's parents, who had flown in from Minnesota so many times, clinging to hope, then demanding justice. Lisa Petrova's devastated roommates and academic mentors at UAA, the loved ones of Maria Sanchez, and the other young women whose names had been added to Thorne's grim, self-narrated tally, finally had answers. But these answers were a poisoned chalice, bringing with them fresh waves of unimaginable grief, anger, and visceral revulsion as the full, sickening extent of Thorne's depravity was laid bare in his cold, articulate confessions. The community as a whole, from the bustling downtown offices to the quiet suburban cul-de-sacs, grappled with the sickening knowledge that such a predator had walked among them, hidden in plain sight for so long. He had perhaps shared a coffee line with them, browsed in the same stores, driven the same streets, a monster cloaked in the utterly mundane. Elias Thorne was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. Given the overwhelming evidence, the eyewitness testimony of Susan Parker, the corroborating details from his confessions, and his ability to lead investigators to previously undiscovered human remains, the legal proceedings were less about determining guilt or innocence, and more about the grim, necessary formalities of the justice system. Psychological evaluations were conducted, as is standard in such cases. Thorne cooperated, perhaps seeing it as another intellectual exercise. But he was, by all legal accounts, deemed sane, his crimes the result of calculated malevolence and profound psychopathy, not a fractured mind unable to comprehend the nature or wrongfulness of his actions in the eyes of the law. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, destined to spend the remainder of his days behind the cold, sterile walls of a maximum security prison, far from the wild, beautiful Alaskan wilderness he had so grotesquely twisted into his personal killing ground and cemetery. Yet, even with Thorne identified, captured, tried, and incarcerated, questions lingered, like the persistent Alaskan twilight that refuses to fully yield to darkness. Were there more victims? His confessions were chillingly detailed for the cases he admitted to, but did they truly encompass the full, horrifying extent of his depravity? The vastness of Alaska, the transient nature of its population during that boom era, it was entirely possible, even probable, that some of his crimes would never be discovered, some victims never identified, their families forever trapped in the agonizing limbo of not knowing, their names lost to the wind and the snow, their stories untold. Thorne himself, during his interrogations, had sometimes hinted at other experiences, other observations, but then would retreat into a smug, enigmatic silence, perhaps savouring these final vestiges of control, these secrets he would take to his grave. The case of the Spenard Specter left an indelible psychic mark on Anchorage. It forced a painful reassessment of public safety, a shattering loss of innocence for a city that had, in some ways, despite its growth, still retained a freewheeling, somewhat naive frontier mentality. It highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in rapid urban expansion and the shadowy corners that can exist even in seemingly close-knit communities when darkness takes root in a human heart. The bars and businesses along Spenard Road continued to operate. The neon lights still flickered their vibrant, sometimes tawdry invitation. But for those who remembered that time of pervasive fear, for those who had known the victims or followed the case with bated breath, the district would always carry a chill, a subtle undercurrent of menace, a reminder of Elias Thorne and the unspeakable darkness he had unleashed upon their city. His story became a grim legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the long, dark Alaskan nights, a chilling warning that monsters are not confined to the pages of fiction, but can indeed walk among us, their true faces hidden until it is far, far too late. Chapter 9. The Unredacted Verdict. You decide. We've journeyed into a dark chapter, a narrative of a cunning and brutal predator who stalked the gritty, neon-lit streets of Spenard, Anchorage, leaving a trail of terror and death in his wake. Elias Thorne, the intelligent, physically imposing figure who blended chilling brutality with calculated, almost academic cunning, does his story ring with the unsettling, granular authenticity of true crime? Or does it feel like a composite nightmare, a meticulously crafted fiction woven from our deepest fears about the monsters who walk among us? Consider the elements we've explored: the specific, historically documented setting of Spenard, with its unique character as a boomtown district, a place of transience, vice, and opportunity, a fertile ground for anonymity. The detailed accounts of the victims, Sarah Jensen and Lisa Petrova, their lives, their dreams, their last known movements, the initial police responses that perhaps faltered, the agonizing wait for their families. The profile of the killer, Elias Thorne, a chilling blend of cold intellect, psychopathic detachment, and sadistic violence, echoing traits of some of history's most notorious and studied serial murderers. The specific, gruesome signature of the crimes, the ritualistic mutilations that point to a deeply disturbed psyche, a need for ultimate possession and control. The inherent challenges of a major crimes investigation in the vast, unforgiving Alaskan landscape, a land that can both reveal and conceal secrets with equal, breathtaking indifference. And finally, the chilling, articulate confessions of Thorne himself, offering a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a predator. Are these the meticulously researched details of a forgotten, horrific case, brought to light from dusty archives, faded case files, and perhaps sealed interrogation transcripts by the unredacted files? Are Sarah Jensen, Lisa Petrova, and Elias Thorne names that should be remembered alongside other true chronicles of Alaskan crime, grim additions to a violent history? Or are they carefully chosen elements, drawn from the dark lexicon of real-world atrocities, from the psychological profiles of known killers, artfully combined and transplanted to the last frontier to create a narrative that feels disturbingly, terrifyingly plausible? A story designed to make you confront the nature of evil itself? The human mind is inherently drawn to patterns, to making sense of the senseless, to finding explanations for the inexplicable. When we are confronted with accounts of such profound evil, such calculated cruelty, we seek to understand its origins, its manifestations, its impact. Sometimes the unvarnished truth of a real case is so stark, so brutal, it almost defies belief, challenging our understanding of human nature, forcing us to acknowledge the darkness that can reside within. Other times, the stories we tell ourselves, the fictions we craft, can tap into those same primal fears, those same archetypes of predator and prey, creating an illusion of reality that is just as compelling, just as terrifying, just as thought-provoking. Elias Thorne, the Spenard Specter. Did he truly cast his long, cold shadow over Anchorage in the late 1970s and early 1980s, his crimes a hidden, festering wound on the city? Or is he a spectre of a different kind? A phantom conjured from the shared, grim DNA of real-world monsters? A composite entity designed to explore the nature of such evil? A cautionary tale given a local habitation, and a name to make us confront the darkness that can exist anywhere, even in a land of such breathtaking natural beauty under the midnight sun. The files on this Alaskan nightmare are now before you. The details, in all their unsettling specificity, have been laid bare. The question, as always, here on the Unredacted Files, remains for you to answer. Is the story of Elias Thorne and the terror he brought to Spenard a chilling chapter of Alaskan true crime, a testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of any community, waiting for its moment to strike? Or is it a carefully constructed fiction, a narrative designed to test your perceptions, to make you question the very nature of the stories you hear, and to explore the enduring power of such tales to grip our imagination and haunt our thoughts? The truth, as they say, is out there. Or perhaps, sometimes, it's crafted right here, in the space between the known and the deeply, chillingly feared. Thank you for joining me in the shadows of the Unredacted Files. Until next time, keep questioning everything. Because the line between the real and the imagined is often the most terrifying and the most enlightening frontier of all.